On Monday, Russia's deputy foreign minister declared that Finland and Sweden joining NATO would be a mistake. On Wednesday, the Nordic neighbors officially submitted their applications to join the alliance. On Saturday, Russia then shut off its gas pipeline to Finland, claiming the move was due to a payment dispute. The debate continues. Is NATO expansion a good idea? Let me bring in the panel. Charlie Kupchan is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was senior director for Europe in President Obama's National Security Council. And Radosław Sikorski was both foreign minister and defense minister of Poland. He is now a member of the European Parliament. Charlie, let me give you a chance to start by stating your case. Why were you, as I recall, back in the 90s and early 2000s, why were you opposed to NATO expansion? What is the case against it?
Well, just to set the record straight, I'm now for it and supportive of Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, precisely because Russia has invaded Ukraine and Finland and Sweden now are looking for more protection. But going back to the 1990s, when this debate took place in the Clinton administration, my view was that to proceed at that time with formal NATO enlargement violated two basic principles. One, include the defeated adversary in the post-war settlement. And by enforcing a new line further east, I fear that the message to Russia was, you're not included. And secondly, the principle of not in my backyard. Major powers generally don't like it when other major powers come into their neighborhood. The United States spent much of its history pushing Europe's great powers and others out of the Western Hemisphere. And so my sense was let's move forward with what was called the Partnership for Peace, a more flexible vehicle that would have allowed Russia as well as other countries to work with NATO. That decision was not taken. How much did NATO enlargement play in the fact that Russia went down a dark path? Very difficult to say. Clearly, flawed democratization, flawed privatization. Putin comes into power, doesn't build a modern economy, turns to Eurasian nationalism, a mystical claim about Russia's importance in the Eurasian sphere. This all played a role in his decision to invade Ukraine. It's very difficult at this point to say how much weight can we assign to the enlargement of NATO.
Radek, what about that argument? Russia is a great power. It does have legitimate interests. And it was not just Putin who was opposed to NATO expansion. It was Yeltsin. And despite repeated Russian objections saying this is a red line for us, there were 5 waves of NATO expansion, right? 15 countries, including your own, about 100 million people brought into the alliance. Isn't that provocative?
Russia has legitimate security interests, but so do Russia's neighbors. In particular, the right to exist, which President Putin is denying to Ukraine. Sweden and Finland want to join NATO for the same reasons that everybody else wanted to join NATO, for common defense, for common protection. And when President Putin now says, no big deal, we'll watch if there are any deployments, that just proves that those so-called realist theories were all wrong, because Putin should now be invading Finland and Sweden, because supposedly even the intention of wanting to join NATO invites invasion. No, President Putin has turned out to be a revisionist aggressor. We need to stop him in Ukraine. If we don't stop him in Ukraine, we will find him on the borders of Poland and Finland. So it's very important that the Ukrainians be given the means to not only defend Kiev, but to recover territory. And I'm very glad that President Biden has signed the package of assistance to Ukraine, and I hope Ukraine will be able to become secure and enjoy the security guarantees that were given to it in the 1990s.
Charlie, I want to dwell on this historical point because it is so crucial. So when I think about this issue, what I wonder about, isn't Ukraine an interesting test case for the thesis that NATO expansion is what caused or what provoked Russia? Because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. and Ukraine's desire to be closer to the West, remember, it was their desire to be closer to the EU in 2014, provoked the Russian expansion and aggression. So imagine a scenario in the 1990s where your advice had been heeded and NATO had not extended membership to Poland. Poland clearly wanted its historic destiny to be in the West. It would have made moves in that direction. If Putin had regarded those moves as illegitimate, and he might have done some military action in Poland, and the West would face the same problem it faces in Ukraine. Not a member of NATO, but a democratic European country that wants to be closer to the West. Are we really not going to help it?
Well, Radek and I now end up in the same place, and I would agree with Radek that Putin is a revisionist aggressor and he needs to be stopped. We'll never be able to replay history. We'll never be able to know whether things would have turned out differently had we proceeded with a strategy that led to the formal enlargement of NATO only if necessary, as opposed to putting the cart before the horse and moving even while Russia was still trying to figure out its future. Me, you, Radek, we're going to be debating this issue until the end of time, and we're never going to get an answer. But I do think that what we're seeing here is a test case, and that Russia has invaded Ukraine. The United States, its NATO allies, have made a decision not to go to war with Russia over this issue. They're not enforcing a no-fly zone. They're not putting boots on the ground. And that's an indication of the desire not to see this escalate, not to see World War III over Ukraine. If that's the case, then why would we want to give a security guarantee to Ukraine? There's a fundamental tension here that we need to resolve. But I do think, yes, it's good to give Ukraine the ability to defend itself. Let's push the Russians as far back as we can. Let's also, in my mind, try to bring this war to a close sooner rather than later, given the risks of escalation, given the blowback on economies around the world. I think, Fareed, this is probably the most dangerous point since the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe more dangerous, because this is a hot war. Bombs are dropping, missiles are flying. This is a very dangerous situation.
We are back with Charlie Kupchan and Radosław Sikorski talking about Finland and Sweden's applications to join NATO and how Putin will react. But let me ask you, Radek, what should we do with Ukraine? What should the West do with Ukraine? I think there's general agreement that the 2008 Bucharest Declaration was badly done, because it vaguely promised NATO and Ukraine and Georgia membership in NATO, but didn't provided no pathway, no timetable. So it was sort of enough to anger Putin without doing enough to protect Ukraine. But how do you resolve that? Should, going forward, Ukraine be given security guarantees by the West?
Actually, you're talking about the 2008 NATO summit, which I attended. The Budapest Declaration was earlier in 1994.
Sorry, Bucharest.
And under
I said
that
Bucharest,
declaration,
sorry.
Bucharest was the NATO summit. The Budapest Declaration was the agreement whereby Russia, primarily, the United States, Britain, and then later France and China, gave Ukraine the guarantees of independence and security of borders in return for Ukraine giving up what was then the world's third largest nuclear stockpile. And Russia has clearly broken the security assurances that it has given. So it's very difficult to deal with a head of state like Mr. Putin, who customarily lies and breaks international agreements.
But what to do about Ukraine? Give it a security guarantee now, or?
Well, we are giving Ukraine something better than security guarantees, namely the means to do what they want to do anyway, which is to defend their land from purges, from war crimes, from deportations to gulags in Russia. Charlie was in the Obama administration, which advised the Ukrainians not to fight in Crimea. That led to Donbass. They didn't then arm Ukraine. So Putin thought that he could take all of Ukraine and extinguish it as an independent nation without paying a price. Well, I'm very glad that the lesson has been learned and that he is now paying a price. And we need to expel him from Ukraine, because if we don't, we'll find him on the border of NATO.
Charlie, you disagree, because you've written a piece in The Atlantic saying the Ukrainians should essentially pocket what gains they have and stop at this point, not try to kind of regain all their territory, right? The problem with that, I just wonder, is the Russians don't seem ready to negotiate even on those terms. I mean, the Ukrainians do seem to want to recover more of their territory, but the Russians, as far as I can tell, are not seriously negotiating about anything at all to end this conflict.
Well, the first point I'd make is kudos to the Biden administration for putting together an amazing coalition and putting on the ground in Ukraine the arms that Ukraine needs to defend itself. I do think, Fareed, that we're getting to a phase of the conflict in which the war is going to be more difficult for the Ukrainians. They're now more on offense than on defense, trying to push back positions that Russia took in 2014. And as a consequence, I do think we're going to see more of a stalemate, and that will provide an opportunity for a conversation with the Ukrainians about their war aims. And yes, it is up to the Ukrainians, but I think the United States, the Poles, other NATO allies should be discussing how to bring the war to an end sooner rather than later. I don't have in my mind some sense of exactly where to stop. Should we push the Russians out of Donbass, but not try to retake Crimea? This is the conversation that needs to take place. But do keep in mind, number one, the risks of escalation. Number two, the blowback effects. I'm very worried that as we head to the midterms, the America First wing of the Republican Party is going to get stronger and stronger. We've seen primary candidates, J.D. Vance in Ohio. He won that primary. What was his policy toward Ukraine? I don't care what happens on the border between Ukraine and Russia. So it's for these reasons that I worry that the staying power, the bipartisan staying power of the United States is uncertain. The unity that we've seen across the Atlantic is uncertain. The Italians have just put forward a peace proposal. This is the time, in my mind, to begin having a conversation with Ukraine and ultimately with Russia about ending the war sooner rather than later.
Radek, I have 45 seconds left, but I want to ask you, fair to say your solution to resolving this conflict is defeat Russia, expel Russia?
Well, we've just had a meeting of the EU-US delegation here in Paris, and that was the bipartisan also on the American side view that Putin needs to be defeated. Only then will Russia reform itself. And if Russia reforms itself, perhaps under different leadership, maybe she would join the West, which would be a good thing.
Radosław Sikorski, Charles Kupchan, pleasure to have both of you on. This debate and discussion will, of course, continue.